Okay, you remember the protests outside of the White House that Trump violently dispersed with tear gas and people being beaten so that he could go do a photo op in front of a church and hold a Bible upside down, which I think is one of the signs of the Antichrist. I'm not sure. I'm not a Christian or anything, but certainly not a good sign. Anyway, it turns out that could have been even worse because the military police preparing to strike against those protesters had a few asks. Equipment that they wanted that thankfully they were denied. So Major Adam DeMarco of the DC National Guard said he was copied on an email from the Provost Marshal of Joint Force Headquarters National Capital Region. He was looking for two things: a long-range acoustic device, a kind of sound cannon known as an LRAD, and a device called the Active Denial System, or ADS. So if you just say Active Denial System, that doesn't sound so bad. That could be anything. Turns out, kind of horrible. The ADS was developed by the military some 20 years ago as a way to disperse crowds. There have been questions about whether it worked or should be deployed in the first place. It uses millimeter wave technology to essentially heat the skin of people targeted by its invisible ray. It was shelved amid concerns about its effectiveness, safety, and the ethics of using it on human beings. And you can sort of understand why. Effectively microwaving protesters seems arguably unethical. Pentagon officials were reluctant to use the device in Iraq. Think about that as context. They were hesitant to use it in Iraq. Of all the things that we did, this is where they were like, well, come on, that's a little barbaric. I don't know about this. Anyway, the Trump administration had weighed using the device on migrants at the US-Mexico border, but Kirstjen Nielsen shot it down, citing humanitarian concerns, and said that no one was to bring it up again in front of her. And again, like with the generals in Iraq, even for Kirstjen Nielsen, this thing seemed to cross a line. So Anna, they didn't end up having one to use here, but a request was put in to use a heat ray on Capitol Hill protesters.
It shouldn't surprise anyone. It's a devastating story and it still makes me sick to my stomach. But if you really take a second to look at the bigger picture and what Americans have allowed to happen for decades with this military industrial complex, of course these weapons would be used against us eventually, right? If we're okay with this type of brutal force being used abroad, and I know you mentioned that there was the potential of using these heat rays against Iraqis, and it wasn't. But still, this technology, this type of weapon was still created, it was built. What do you think it was built for? Possibly for use abroad, and eventually it will end up in our local police departments, as most Pentagon weapon inventory does, and it will be used against people like us. That's why we can't see ourselves as different from civilians abroad. We can't see ourselves as somehow special compared to citizens in other countries. If our government is willing to develop this type of technology to brutalize others abroad, I have no doubt, and we have seen proof, that the very same weapons will either be considered for use against Americans or eventually will actually be used against Americans. That's why it's so important to have an internationalist view of American politics, because the actions that we take that impact other countries abroad will come back to us. And by the way, I mean, I'm making that argument for people who only care about themselves, but we should show solidarity with people abroad. We should care about human lives abroad. It shouldn't always be that we're the priority and humans in other countries are somehow dehumanized. That's what happens over and over again. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, 100%. You know what? I wanna. Can we skip to the photo? Let's bring up what this looks like. This is a thing that was requested to be used against those protesters. Like, yeah, that's what they deploy against Godzilla in the movies, effectively. Not people who were protesting against the president. They had guitars. That's what they had. They had flowers. They were peaceful protesters. And look, they didn't use the ADS. Okay, and they apparently didn't use the LRAD either, which is apparently its own problem because you're apparently legally obligated to inform protesters about the plans to clear out an area. They clearly didn't do that. People didn't know. That's apparently breaking the law. LRAD, which can be used as a sort of sonic cannon, also can be used to relay those sorts of orders. It's a very mixed thing. But anyway, they may not have had the heat ray, but let's remember what they actually did. They did gas those peaceful protesters. They did go into you've seen the videos, just swinging clubs and full body shields and things like that, brutalizing people, including members of the media, just so that Trump could walk across and look like a tough guy. He obviously failed at that because he doesn't have the physical capacity to do so, but that was the desire, to brutalize the protesters. They didn't microwave them, but they did brutalize them in the end.
Yeah, and there's a point to brutalizing them. It sends a message. It's meant to intimidate protesters. It's meant to send a message to anyone who plans to organize and take action out on the streets. It's a form of intimidation. So it's just something to keep in mind, as every single year, both Democrats and Republicans sign on for budget increases for the National Defense Authorization Act. That's the military budget. These lawmakers need to be held accountable because our taxpayer money, we are literally funding through our federal taxes the development of these types of weapons, which certainly get used abroad on people in other countries, but then of course, eventually will be used against us. We are funding our own destruction every single day. And at the same time, when we need unemployment insurance, when we need help during a pandemic because tens of millions of people have lost their jobs, the federal government, including congressional Democrats, give us a giant middle finger. When it comes to increasing the military budget, oh, no question, of course we have to do it, right?
100%, yeah. Yeah, it all comes back. It's a peaceful protest.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.